Picture this. You're standing in a narrow coastal pass. On one side, black waves crash violently against the cliffs. On the other, sheer rock walls rise straight up like they were cut by an axe. And right in front of you, a Persian army so massive it blots out the entire horizon. You have 300 brothers at your side. They have hundreds of thousands of soldiers, armed to the teeth. Deep down, you know the truth. This place, Thermopylae, is where your story ends. Nobody's walking away from this one, but you don't retreat. You just tighten your grip on your blood-soaked spear. Sound familiar? Did times 300 times get your blood pumping? Did it make you believe Leonidas was some noble hero, fighting for freedom and democracy, screaming, "This is Sparta"? Well, what if I told you that you've been lied to? Completely. Thoroughly. Top to bottom. In this video, I'm going to smash that Hollywood filter to pieces, because the real Leonidas was no wise and noble savior. He was a tyrant. A cold-blooded killing machine, manufactured by one of the most psychotic, most brutal systems in human history. Sounds like it breaks everything you thought you knew, right? Good. Sit back and get comfortable, because what you're about to hear is a story so dark, so twisted, even times Game of Thrones times wouldn't dare go there. When you think of ancient Greece, what comes to mind? Philosophers in white robes, sunny marble temples on the Acropolis, wine and wisdom, and the meaning of life. Erase that image. Right now. Sparta had nothing to do with any of that. Instead, picture a dark, heavy classical oil painting. No highlights, just brutal contrasts of shadow and stone, grey rock, scorched earth. That's Sparta, a giant military fortress locked deep in the rocky hills of Laconia. No poetry, no art, just absolute obedience, and the constant smell of blood. Why did they live like this? Were they just born loving suffering? The answer is completely counterintuitive. They were scared. Every single day, they lived on the edge of a fear that would drive most people insane. Scared of who, you ask? Not Persia? Not some foreign empire? They were scared of the people living right under their feet, the Helots. In Sparta, the so-called equals, the full citizens, were actually a tiny minority. Meanwhile, the enslaved Helots who farmed their land, cooked their food, and did every dirty job imaginable. Their numbers were staggering. In some regions, slaves outnumbered their masters 10 to 1. Think about what that actually means. Imagine living in a mansion with 20 massive, furious bodybuilders as your household servants, and every single one of them hates your guts. Every bite of bread you eat, every grain of wheat in your storehouse, the Helots grew all of it. Every morning when a Spartan opened his eyes, the first thought wasn't, "Nice day today." It was, "If those slaves decide to rise up tonight, will my entire family be dead by sunset?" This wasn't paranoia. This was the sword of Damocles, dangling over every Spartan's head every single day. That bone-deep fear drove Sparta to make a decision that was, frankly, sick. If you're outnumbered this badly, how do you keep them in line? The answer was simple and utterly inhumane. You use terror. They turned the entire country into a factory for producing killers. And to test that factory, Sparta created an institution that makes modern people's skin crawl, the Krypteia, the secret death squad. Don't let the name fool you into thinking it was some elite intelligence agency. This was literally a legalized murder squad made up of Spartan teenagers who had just started growing facial hair. These kids were handed a dagger and almost no food, then thrown out into the countryside like stray dogs. Their one and only job? Hunt. You heard that right, hunt people. And their targets weren't enemy spies. They were unarmed Helot slaves. Any slave who looked a little too strong, a little too confident. Anyone who seemed like they could be a leader, they went straight onto the kill list. These teenagers would slip into Helot homes in the dead of night. No warning, no trial. Blade in, lights out. What do you call that? State-sponsored terrorism. Systematic. Deliberate. On one hand, it kept the slaves too terrified to even think about rebellion. On the other hand, it was training battle prep for the next generation of Spartan warriors. Think about it. How do you send someone into a real war if they don't know what killing feels like? Sparta's logic was brutal. Before you face an enemy army, you need to wash your hands in your own slaves' blood first. These boys learn to move like ghosts. They learned to drive a blade into someone's chest without even blinking. They weren't even adults yet, and they were already soaked in blood. This was the world that greeted Leonidas when he was born, around 540 BC. Still think that Hollywood hero looks the same. In a society that dark, where kindness meant weakness and compassion meant death, Leonidas had no childhood, no toys, no playgrounds, just blood on the ground and nerves permanently wound to snapping point. And here's the cruel irony. He was a prince. But he was a prince nobody gave a damn about. His father was king of the Agiad dynasty, one of Sparta's 2 royal houses. Wait, 2 kings? Yes, Sparta had 2 kings simultaneously. In theory, a check on tyranny. In practice, just 2 factions grinding each other down in an endless power struggle. In this mess, his father had several sons. The eldest, Cleomenes, was the clear heir, protected, sheltered, exempt from Sparta's harshest military training. The second, Dorius, wasn't so lucky he got thrown into the machine. And Leonidas, the third, he was spare parts. Nobody expected him to rule. Nobody was grooming him for it. But that's exactly what made his nightmare begin. Do you want to know what Sparta does to a 7-year-old boy? At age 7, Leonidas was ripped from his mother's arms and thrown into a military training program called the Agoge. Don't picture summer camp. This was a decade plus of state-sanctioned abuse with no human rights protections whatsoever. What was his first day equipment? A warm bed? A pair of shoes? Not a chance. Year-round, winter and summer alike, they were issued a single worn cloak, no shoes. Not even sleeping mats, you had to go pull reeds from the river and weave your own. Can't make one? Then sleep in the cold mud. But that wasn't even the worst part. Instructors deliberately withheld food. They kept the boys in a permanent state of near starvation. What were you supposed to do about it? The instructors had a suggestion. Steal bread, cheese, meat, whatever you could grab. And here's where it gets twisted. In Sparta, theft itself was not the crime. Getting caught was. If you stole without being caught, congratulations, you eat tonight. If you got caught, you got beaten savagely. Not for being dishonest, for being stupid and weak. This sick, hunger-fueled system forced children to hunt food like animals. Older boys could bully and beat younger ones freely. It wasn't called abuse, it was called building discipline. There were even public flogging competitions at religious temples, where boys were beaten until they vomited blood and passed out, while adults cheered and applauded. After thousands of days of beatings, starvation, and brutality, did Leonidas break? Did he become one of those hollow, dead-eyed boys who just followed orders? Neither. He absorbed it all like a sponge soaked in blood. Every empty stomach, every scar. He turned each one into experience. Into armor. Out of all that silence, he developed the Spartan superpower laconic wit, the ability to say more with 3 words than most people manage in 3 paragraphs. The Spartans believed that rambling was weakness, losing control of your emotions was shameful. A real man speaks like a spear, straight, fast, and lethal. Just when Leonidas had finally survived that hellish training and reached adulthood, everything at the top changed. 3. Around 520 BC, the old king died, and Cleomenes, the pampered eldest son, took the throne. This guy had never been through the system. He had never been hit, never been humbled. And very quickly he started to unravel. Arrogant, reckless, picking fights with neighbouring city-states one day, then getting accused of bribing the oracle the next. Watching his increasingly unhinged brother sit on the throne, the second son Dorius completely snapped. He thought, I crawled through the mud for years. Why should I bow to this clown? So he made the most un-Spartan decision possible. He left. He took his men overseas and tried to carve out his own kingdom. He ran straight into Carthage's forces, completely wiped out, died in a foreign land. And while all this played out, our third son, Leonidas, was watching, waiting. He didn't compete. He didn't complain. He just quietly showed up every day patrolling borders, putting down slave uprisings coiled like a viper in the shadows, biding his time. Then Cleomenes finally, completely lost it. The Spartan Council of Ephors had seen enough. They declared him insane, locked him in chains, and threw him in prison. A man who'd been all-powerful yesterday, a prisoner today. The official story? He He requested a knife in his cell and cut himself to pieces. Do you believe that? Historians don't either. It was clearly a political assassination. The system disposed of him. Cleomenes was dead. Dorius was dead. The royal family looked around and realized there was exactly one man left. The overlooked, the forgotten, the one nobody had ever bet on. Around 490 BC, this silent, scarred survivor of Sparta's killing machine became king. Not through brilliance, not through plotting, but simply by outlasting everyone else. The kind of story a fantasy novel writer would consider too convenient. But before the throne even had time to get warm, a storm powerful enough to erase Greece from the map was already sweeping in from the east. That same year, the Persian king Darius had suffered the unthinkable. His army was crushed by the Athenians at the Battle of Marathon. For Persia, this was the greatest humiliation imaginable. Darius swore revenge, but before he could launch his campaign, he died. His son Xerxes picked up the torch and the rage. For Xerxes, this wasn't just military failure, it was a personal insult on a cosmic scale. He assembled the largest army the ancient world had ever seen and marched toward the heart of Greece. Was Sparta rattled? This is where Leonidas showed a steadiness almost no one else could match. And part of that steadiness came from his wife, Queen Gorgo, arguably the sharpest mind in all of ancient Greece. There was a Spartan spy deep inside Persia, desperately trying to send back intelligence about Xerxes' massive mobilization. He carved his warning onto a wooden tablet, then covered the whole thing in wax, making it look completely blank. The tablet arrived in Sparta. The entire court stared at it, baffled. Was this a joke? Then Gorgo stepped forward. Calmly, she said, "Scrape off the wax." The hidden message appeared before everyone's eyes. Without that woman, Sparta might have been sleepwalking when the Persians arrived at the door. Xerxes' advance envoys came first arrogant Persian ambassadors, strutting through Greek city-states, demanding offerings of earth and water. This wasn't a gardening request. In ancient diplomatic language, it meant total submission. Surrender your sovereignty. Many Greek city-states caved immediately, better alive and humiliated than dead and proud. But when the Persian envoys stood before Leonidas and laid the same demand at his feet, he didn't even blink. What he did next made Persian jaws drop. It made all of Greece inhale sharply. Leonidas looked at the Persians and said, calmly, "Want Spartan earth and water? Go down and get it yourselves." And before the words had finished echoing, Spartan soldiers grabbed those ambassadors and threw them down a well. This wasn't a refusal. This was lighting a firework on top of Xerxes' powder keg. In the ancient world, killing envoys even during war was an absolute taboo, a line no civilized state would cross. With that one act, Leonidas welded every diplomatic door shut. He'd strapped all of Sparta, all of Greece, onto a runaway chariot with no brakes. After the envoys went down the well, the whole of Greece erupted. Everyone understood. Xerxes was coming now, with everything he had. While other city-states were still arguing and trembling, an Athenian strategist named Themistocles pulled out a map and pointed to one location. "We stopped them here." That place was Thermopylae. Why there? Simple. Cliffs on one side, sea on the other. Just a narrow sliver of land in between. Xerxes could have 1,000,000 men, and it wouldn't matter. They'd have to come through single file. Numbers advantage gone. Airtight logic, right? But when Leonidas was ready to march north, his own leadership blocked him. The reason? You won't believe it. They were celebrating a religious festival. The Carneia. Spartan law was absolutely clear. No warfare during the festival period. First you serve the gods, then you fight. On one side, an army capable of ending civilization. On the other, a religious statute written in stone. But Leonidas hadn't survived Sparta's grinder by letting rules stop him. He walked into the council chamber and said, "Fine. Don't mobilize the full army. I'll just take my personal bodyguard 300 men out for a little scouting trip." That's not warfare, is it? The council grumbled, found a way to save face, and approved it. The original rules lawyer. The ancient world's master of loopholes. But the way he selected those 300 men reveals something deeply chilling. He didn't pick the fastest. He didn't pick the most decorated fighters. He added one non-negotiable condition. Can you guess what it was? Every single one of those 300 men had to already have a son, a male heir. Why? Because from the very beginning, Leonidas had no intention of bringing them home. This was a carefully calculated, legally sanctioned suicide mission. He needed to ensure that after these men died at the front, their family lines would still survive to serve Sparta. He was using them down to the bone marrow. Before leaving, how do you think he said goodbye to his wife? No tears, no embrace, no lingering Hollywood kiss. Gorgo had been trained since childhood to believe that male weakness was worse than death. She simply asked, with icy calm, "When you're gone, what should I do?" Leonidas answered in the most brutally direct way possible. "Find a good man, marry him, have good children." That wasn't a farewell. That was a final instruction to a machine. On the road, passing the oracle at Delphi, they received a prophecy that nailed his fate in place. Either Sparta burns to the ground, or a Spartan king dies. For most people, that's a death sentence delivered by the gods themselves. For Leonidas, a man forged in a furnace since childhood, it was almost a relief. The uncertainty was gone. He now had exactly one objective: to die well. He marched his 300, along with several thousand Greek allies scraped together from various city-states, to the gates of Thermopylae. When the Persian army finally appeared on the horizon, I want you to imagine the siege of Helm's Deep in times, the Lord of the Rings times, and then multiply it by 10. Dust clouds swallowed the sun. 200,000 soldiers poured forward like a black tide. Xerxes sat on his golden throne above the pass, looking down at the handful of Greeks below, fully expecting them to faint with fear and beg for their lives. What he saw instead made him question his own sanity. The Spartans weren't running. They were calmly, almost leisurely combing their hair. Some were stretching, like they were warming up for a casual workout, not staring down the greatest military force on earth. Xerxes sent a messenger. "Lay down your weapons. I'll spare your lives." Leonidas sent back 2 words that became one of the most famous phrases in Western military history. "Molon Labe. Come and take them. Negotiations over." The gates of hell swung open. Xerxes sent in the first wave, the Medes flooding into the narrow pass. They expected to trample these savages into paste, using sheer numbers. Instead, they ran headfirst into a moving wall of bronze and muscle. Spartan heavy infantry locked their massive shields together into a seamless barrier. Then from behind that wall, a forest of razor-sharp spears exploded forward. Persian leather armor and wooden shields didn't stand a chance against Greek spears 2 meters long. The men at the front were skewered through the cheeks and throat before they could react. The men behind them were whipped forward by officers, crammed into the bottleneck. The entire pass turned into an automatic meat grinder. Persian bodies piled up so fast they literally reshaped the terrain. And where was Leonidas? Not in the rear, sipping water and giving orders. He was at the front of that machine, covered in blood and sweat, barking short commands, controlling the rhythm of the slaughter. The Spartans even ran rotation drills, mid-battle, front row tired. Back row gears in seamlessly. No gap, no crack. Xerxes watched his men get harvested like wheat from his hilltop perch. He reportedly stood up from his throne in rage 3 times. On the second day, desperate, he unleashed his ultimate weapon, the Immortals. 10,000 of Persia's finest elite soldiers. Kept at full strength at all times, replace one, another appears. They were supposed to overwhelm these barbarians in minutes. Instead, they queued up in a narrow corridor and got stabbed one by one. And then, the Spartans played them perfectly. Mid-battle, the Spartan line suddenly buckled, faking a collapse, and turned and ran. The Immortals lit up. They charged forward, breaking formation in their excitement. Then a horn blast. The Spartans spun on their heels, shields locked, spears driven forward in a single synchronized thrust. The charging Immortals ran directly into it. Slaughter. Xerxes reportedly jumped up from his throne 3 times that day, his greatest army in the world, bouncing off a wall of 300 men. 2 days of carnage. The most powerful empire on earth, bleeding itself out against a door it couldn't open. If the frontal assault had continued, Xerxes might truly have lost everything. But history is brutal, and at the critical moment, a traitor always appears. A local man who had never drawn a sword in his life was about to end Leonidas and his 300 men with a few quiet words. His name was Ephialtes. He wasn't a general. He wasn't a strategist. He was just a local farmer, and he walked into the Persian camp in the dead of night for gold. He sold Xerxes the one piece of information that could undo everything. A hidden mountain path, the Anapia Trail, that wound all the way around to the rear of the Greek position. The Spartan front was an impenetrable wall of bronze, but their back? Completely exposed. Xerxes' eyes lit up. He immediately sent his top commanders with the recently battered immortals on a night march through the mountains. Now, Leonidas wasn't naive. He knew about that path. He'd stationed 1,000 Phocian soldiers there specifically to guard it. But what the Phocians did next became a masterclass in how not to hold a defensive position. In the middle of the night, they woke to the sound of clanking armor and boots crushing leaves, thousands of Persian heavy infantry crawling up the slope. The correct move? Hold the narrow path. Force the Persians to climb into your spears. The uphill attack would be suicidal for them. What did the Phocians actually do? They panicked and retreated up the mountain, handing the path directly to the Persians. Like installing a high-security front door and then leaving the back key under the mat for the burglar. The Persians didn't even stop to deal with them. They had one objective: get around behind the Greeks. Fast. At dawn on the third day, a breathless messenger stumbled into the Greek camp with news worse than any nightmare. The mountain path was gone. Persian forces were already descending from above. If you were Leonidas in that moment, what would you do? Stay and get surrounded, or retreat, live to fight another day? Leonidas called a meeting. It was grim. Commanders from other city-states argued loudly for withdrawal. Defending a doomed pass was suicide. There was no logical reason to stay, but inside Leonidas's head, the oracle's words were still ringing. A Spartan king must die. If he ran today, yes, the Persians couldn't catch him. But the myth of Spartan invincibility and the spine of Greek resistance would shatter in that instant. He had been calculating the cost of his own life since childhood. He knew exactly what his death was worth, so he issued a command that stunned everyone. The Allied forces were to withdraw south immediately. At this point you might think heroic, self-sacrificing, noble, but real history is always darker than the movies. He did let most of the men go, but he forcibly held back 400 Theban soldiers. Why? Because Thebes had been getting suspiciously friendly with Persia. He didn't trust them, so he used them as human shields hostages, bound to the front line. Cold Spartan arithmetic. There were also 700 Thespian soldiers who chose to stay voluntarily. Their hometown sat just south of Thermopylae. Once that gate broke, their wives and children would be the first to die. They had no retreat. They chose to burn here alongside the Spartans. The pass now held roughly 1,000 men, and the sun was rising on the third day. The air felt different that morning. No more composure. Everyone could smell death. The Spartans ate their last hard rations in silence and tightened their helmet straps. Leonidas walked the line past these 300 men he had grown up with, starved with, bled with. He didn't give a long patriotic speech. In true laconic fashion, he delivered the most bone-chilling final order imaginable. Spartans eat well now. Tonight, we dine in the underworld. Translation: this is the last meal you'll have on this earth. Eat up. We're going to the afterlife together. The previous 2 days had been about holding the wall. The third day, everything changed. The new order: abandon the defensive position. Full charge. Did that sound insane? That was the point. When death is already guaranteed, there's no reason to play defense. Convert every last breath into pure destruction. Take as many of them with you as you can. The survivors, bloody, half-broken, burning with something beyond rage, burst out from behind the wall and charged directly into the Persian front. Day 3 was no longer a battle. It was animals tearing each other apart. The Spartans abandoned formation. Their spears broke, they drew short swords. Swords bent, they fought bare-handed. Leonidas charged at the front like a force of nature, cutting down Persian officers and standard-bearers, deliberately shredding their command structure and sowing chaos. And then, somewhere in that storm of iron and blood, Leonidas fell. No slow-motion collapse, no lingering gaze at the sky. In the chaos of real battle, he was most likely skewered by spears and arrows simultaneously, reduced to a broken body in seconds. But what happened next showed the terrifying power of the machine Sparta had built. The king was down, and the Spartans didn't break. They went berserk. They formed an iron ring around Leonidas's body and refused to give an inch. For the Persians, capturing an enemy king's corpse was the ultimate trophy. For the Spartans, letting that body be defiled was worse than the destruction of Sparta itself. 1,000 times worse. For that broken body, both sides fought like rabid dogs. The Persians launched 4 massive charges. All 4 were repelled. In that brutal fight over a dead man's remains, 2 of Xerxes' own brothers were killed outright by Spartan hands, war mad to the end. But individual fury eventually loses to physics. As the Persian encirclement closed in from behind, the surviving Greeks, a few hundred blood-soaked fighters, were pushed back to a small hillock, their last few square meters on earth. Spears gone. Shields demolished, swords missing. What did they fight with? Stones, fists, teeth literally biting at Persian throats. Xerxes stood back and watched these men weaponless, barely standing still fighting, and he was afraid. The man who owned the entire world was afraid of a few dozen unarmed, half-dead warriors. He made the most cowardly decision of his life. He ordered the archers to fire. Thousands of bowstrings drew back at once. The arrows came down like a monsoon. Remember what a Spartan had joked earlier? The Persian arrows will blot out the sun? Good then, we'll fight in the shade. When the arrows stopped, nothing moved on that hillock. The Thespians gone, the Spartans gone. The Theban hostages threw down their weapons and surrendered. In return, they were branded on their faces with the mark of Persian slaves. Among the heaps of bodies, Xerxes found Leonidas. Ancient Greek tradition, even between mortal enemies, dictated that a fallen commander's body be returned for proper burial. Xerxes had been broken by 3 days of this nightmare. He threw every tradition aside. In a fit of impotent rage, he ordered Leonidas's head cut off and mounted on a stake for all to see. He thought that single act of desecration would crush the Greek spirit. He was spectacularly wrong. When the news spread across Greece, the reaction wasn't fear, it was contempt. The king of the most powerful empire in the world reduced to mutilating a corpse to recover some dignity. The entire Greek world read it the same way. Xerxes had just shown everyone how badly those 3 days had broken him. And those 3 days at Thermopylae accomplished exactly what they needed to. Athens used the time to evacuate its entire civilian population. Themistocles placed every chip on the navy. A few months later, in the narrow straits of Salamis, the Greek fleet used the exact same choke point strategy and destroyed the Persian armada. Xerxes sat on the shore and watched his invincible fleet sink. Without naval supply lines, his hundreds of thousands of soldiers became starving mouths with nowhere to go. Xerxes fled back to Asia in the night, leaving a fraction of his forces behind. They were finally crushed the following year at the Battle of Plataea by Spartan heavy infantry. That's the real story of Thermopylae. Strip away the Hollywood filter, and Leonidas is not a white knight fighting for the noble cause of freedom and democracy. He was the product of a brutal slave state. A killing machine, programmed since childhood by a system designed to produce exactly that. He didn't die for some lofty personal belief. He died because the oracle said so. Because the cold, pitiless law of Sparta demanded it. He never owned his own life, not for a single day. And yet this is where history becomes both absurd and breathtaking. This man, twisted and shaped by a monstrous machine, this emotionless instrument of obedience at the single most critical moment in the story of Western civilization, drove himself into the earth like a bronze nail and held the door shut. He didn't bring his shield home, but with his life, he became one. So the next time you hear, "This is Sparta," I hope what comes to mind isn't a chiseled action hero with perfect abs. I hope you see the real man. The boy who gripped a dagger in the dark and shook with fear, who clawed his way to a throne over the bodies of his brothers, who stood in a narrow pass with 300 men he'd grown up bleeding alongside, and chose, with perfect clarity, to become an arrow in someone else's bow, and never came home. All right. Now, for tonight's second story, ancient American civilizations. They are far older than we ever imagined. Picture this in your head right now. A group of primitive people, wrapped in animal skins, shivering as they crossed the Bering Land Bridge through ice and snow. Around 13,000 years ago, they finally set foot on the untouched land of the Americas. And then what? They hunted bison for generation after generation until Columbus sailed over and delivered them civilization. Sound familiar? Isn't that exactly the answer you memorized in history class, word for word? But what if I told you today everything you memorized is garbage? And not just garbage, carefully filtered garbage. The version of American history that's been fed to you is deeply, seriously distorted. In this video, we're going to rip that textbook apart. We're not talking about Columbus. We're not talking about the worn-out 13,000 years ago origin story, because the strange fragments buried deep beneath South America and the prehistoric technologies hidden inside the Amazon rainforest are going to absolutely destroy everything you thought you knew. Don't argue with me yet. Just hear this first. At White Sands National Park in New Mexico, scientists dug up hundreds of fossilized human footprints deep underground. Not just a few prints, a clear trail left by a group of people walking through soft mud. Right beside them, the footprints of woolly mammoths and giant ground sloths from the Ice Age. How old do you think they are? Radiocarbon dating put them at 21,000 to 23,000 years old. That single discovery pushed the human arrival timeline in the Americas back by a full 10,000 years. What does that mean? It means that when the textbooks say the Americas were completely uninhabited, people were already out there strolling around with mammoths. But here's what's even more outrageous, you'd think. With evidence this solid, the history books would be updated, right? Think again. In certain academic circles, some truths are simply not allowed to exist. You're probably asking if the past is this complicated. If there's so much world-flipping evidence buried underground, why do our experts and professors refuse to accept it? The answer is painfully simple. Because if they accept it, they're admitting that their life's work is built on sand. In archaeology, there's one tool treated like a sacred oracle: radiocarbon dating. Dig up a bone or a piece of wood with carbon in it, run it through the machine, and supposedly you can pin down events from tens of thousands of years ago. But do you know this so-called gold standard has a fatal flaw? Carbon-14 dating rests on one critical assumption, that the concentration of carbon-14 inches the atmosphere has always been constant. Does that even make sense? One massive volcanic eruption, a slight spike in cosmic radiation, and that carbon level shifts, throwing results off by thousands of years, completely undetected. It's like using a broken scale to weigh your groceries and trusting every number it shows. But the experts don't care. If the results match their textbooks, that's a groundbreaking discovery. If the results go way outside the expected range, oh, that's obviously contamination. Straight to the bin. Here's a perfect example. At a site in Mexico called Huiatlaco, archaeologists dug up a piece of charred wood from an extremely deep layer of sediment. The first round of carbon dating came back at 250,000 years old. 250,000 years. That's a slap across the face of mainstream academia. So what happened? Because the number was too absurd, too far outside the accepted timeline of human presence in the Americas, the experts dismissed it immediately. Contamination, measurement error, no further discussion. The wood was shelved. The excavation was shut down. Can't solve the problem? Just eliminate the evidence. Classic move. And it gets more ridiculous. At the Pedra Furada site in Brazil, researchers uncovered stone tools dating back 32,000 years. But because there were no organic materials suitable for carbon dating nearby, the conservative experts simply looked the other way and declared the stones were naturally shaped by wind and water, nothing to do with humans. Wind and water can produce bladed tools? Why not just say monkeys typed out Shakespeare while you're at it? Behind all of this is one of academia's darkest open secrets. Many top dating laboratories will quietly refuse to process samples that look too old based on where they came from. That's not a technical limitation. That's soft censorship. Only data that fits the expected narrative gets accepted. One archaeologist even admitted he had to lie about the excavation site when submitting a sample, because if he told the truth, the lab would have rejected it outright. When science starts filtering data based on belief systems and insider circles, can we really call what we're taught real history? So never blindly trust any so-called absolute truth. When dating tools become the chains that limit our thinking, the real history of the Americas has been locked inside the shadows of academic assumptions all along. But if you're willing to tear down that wall and truly listen to the ancient journals written in stone and soil, you'll find that on this continent, There were once prehistoric giants who treated solid rock like soft clay. While the stuffy experts argue over fragments of bone until their faces turn red, let's shift our view to the Andes Mountains nearly 4,000 meters above sea level. The air is so thin up here, 2 steps and you're gasping. But right on the shores of the breathtaking Lake Titicaca sits a prehistoric ruin that makes engineers across the modern world question their careers. Tiwanaku. The massive stone blocks here look like they came off a factory, production line. The precision of the cuts is absurd. Stone locks into stone with zero mortar, zero gap. You can't slide a sheet of paper between them. And it has stood like that for thousands of years. This doesn't look like an ancient ruin. It looks like a construction site run by a very obsessive alien. But wait, there's something even more mind-bending nearby. Not far from Tiwanaku lies a ruin called Puma Punku, Gate of the Puma. The site is not large, but it brings the world's top engineers to their knees. Scattered across the ground are enormous H-shaped stone blocks, perfect geometric right angles, surfaces so smooth they look laser-cut, with precisely centered drill holes. You're telling me primitive humans thousands of years ago chipped these out one tap at a time with another rock? Go ahead, try it. These things don't look like hand-carved stone at all. They look like modular components mass-produced by a modern CNC machine. And here's the wild part. Modular construction is a concept the modern construction industry only started embracing in recent decades. The most outrageous detail. Each of these blocks weighs over 100 tons. The quarry is 10 kilometers away. Close your eyes and picture it at high altitude, with no wheels, no cranes, no large draft animals. How did these ancient builders move 100-ton boulders up a mountain? Pure willpower. Mainstream academia just mutters, well, they had a lot of people. They figured it out over time. That's like saying if you give a monkey enough time, it'll write Windows from scratch. Many independent researchers actually suspect this wasn't a temple at all, but a prehistoric stone laboratory. Local indigenous mythology has always carried a story that the earliest gods needed no vehicles. They possessed a technology that could soften stone, make it pliable like kneading clay. Is that mythology? Or is it our own ignorance about lost technology? While your brain is still tingling from South America's prehistoric engineering, let's head a bit north to a city that completely rewrites the history of human warfare. In the Supe Valley of Peru sits an ancient city called Caral. When the Egyptians were still drafting blueprints for their pyramids, when the Sumerians had just started pressing words into clay tablets, the people of Caral had already built a massive stone city in 2600 BC. But the most astonishing thing about it isn't its age, it's this. Not a single weapon was found here. Not one defensive wall. Can you imagine? One of the earliest known cities in human history was a complete, total, love and peace civilization. No war. Their daily life was trade, music, and playing flutes carved from bird bones. And when they built their pyramids, they packed stone-filled reed bags as earthquake-resistant foundations, a seismic engineering technique that modern builders are still borrowing from today. Where did these ancient pacifists learn advanced architecture and physics? Your brain probably feels stretched already. But hold on tight, because the next civilization about to walk in is going to stir the waters of American history even further. Deep in the sweltering jungle swamps of Mesoamerica, there lived a people modern researchers call the Rubber People, the Olmec. They left no written history, no names, but they pulled off something that gives people chills. To this day, they left behind 20 colossal basalt heads in the jungle, each one 2 to 3 meters tall, the heaviest weighing 50 tons. No wheels, no draft animals, and somehow these stones were moved from dozens of kilometers away. That's not even the most unsettling part. Stare at the faces of these stone heads for a few seconds and you'll get goosebumps. Why? Because the wide jaws, thick lips, and broad noses on these sculptures look nothing like any known indigenous American population. Many independent scholars take one look and say these facial features look distinctly African. Does that mean thousands of years before Columbus discovered the New World, African seafarers had already crossed the ocean and set up shop in the Americas? Mainstream experts refuse to acknowledge it, but these silent stone giants stand there, quietly mocking the narrowness of modern science. And here's another detail: many of these heads were discovered face down, deliberately buried in the earth. Was that a mysterious burial ritual? Or were they deliberately hiding something from the future? Something they didn't want us to see? If the Olmec giant heads already felt strange, let's talk about the civilization everyone thinks they know, the Maya. When you hear Maya, you probably think 2012 doomsday predictions or moss-covered jungle pyramids. But what you almost certainly don't know is that more than 1,000 years before those famous Maya tourist sites became famous, a super empire was hidden deep in the jungle. The city was called El Mirador. Its main pyramid, Ladanta, is actually larger in total volume than the Great Pyramid of Giza in Egypt. In the dense tropical rainforest of Guatemala, where even modern hikers get lost. These people didn't just build pyramids bigger than mountains. They built artificial highways, stretching for kilometers. They engineered sophisticated rainwater collection and water management systems. But the most chilling part? This prehistoric mega-empire, which ruled over more than 1 million people, left not a single name in later Maya mythology or recorded history. It's as if someone hit Shift-Delete on history's hard drive and wiped it completely clean. This disturbing gap shows up even more sharply when you look at Maya writing and their calendar. You'd think the Maya developed their writing system gradually over centuries, right? Wrong. Their hieroglyphic system appeared almost as if it was airdropped in fully formed, fully developed, right from the start. And their calendar? The Maya calculated the solar year with an error of just 0.002 days compared to what we measure today using high-tech satellites. No telescopes, no computers. How? Were they all living calculators? Which raises an uncomfortable question: did the Maya actually invent this system themselves? On a stone block from around 900 BC, found in ancient Olmec territory, there are already markings that look like primitive writing. If that's confirmed, the history of writing in the Americas gets pushed back another 1,000 years. But because that's too inconvenient, the mainstream textbooks simply pretend it doesn't exist. It's like acing a test and having your teacher accuse you of cheating because she doesn't believe you're smart enough. For decades, experts assumed Maya pyramids were just observation platforms for stargazing or ritual ceremonies. Then recently, divers and ground-penetrating radar beneath the famous pyramids at Chichen Itza found something massive directly below these enormous structures. There are vast natural sinkholes and underground water systems, sacred wells. You think that's a coincidence? Absolutely not. The Maya deliberately built their pyramids over these underground voids. Why? Because in their worldview, these bottomless pools weren't for drinking water. They were portals, gateways, straight to the underworld, which they called Xibalba. Imagine standing at the edge of one of these underground pools. The water is still as a black mirror, reflecting the torchlight above. The Maya believed that through this mirror, you could open a direct line to the gods of death below. To please those gods, they threw in gold and jade, but that wasn't enough. Archaeologists have pulled human bones from the bottom of these wells, many of them children. This wasn't a blessing ceremony. This was paying a literal toll to the underworld in human lives. Even more fascinating, the Maya selected these sacred wells using extreme acoustic engineering. Sound bouncing off the water surface creates an eerie, delayed echo like voices whispering back to you from the underworld. And since we're on the subject of human sacrifice, we have to talk about Mesoamerica's true masters of the practice. Follow me north to a city whose name is pure mythology, Teotihuacan, the city of the gods. How significant was this place? It had the largest sun pyramid in the Americas at the time. At its peak, it housed nearly 200,000 people, more populous than most major European cities of the same era. But here's the great irony: when the famous Aztecs arrived here, the city had already been abandoned for over 700 years. Not a soul remained. The Aztecs looked up at these towering stone structures and immediately assumed gods had built them. In other words, the mighty Aztec Empire was just squatting in someone else's abandoned ruins. And who the original builders were, what language they spoke, what they called themselves to this day, no one knows. The pyramid alignment at Teotihuacan perfectly matches Orion's belt, exactly like the pyramids at Giza on the other side of the planet. You want to call that coincidence? It looks more like two branches of the same ancient guild were working from the same blueprints, but the truly high-voltage stuff is buried beneath the Temple of the Feathered Serpent. In 2003, archaeologists broke open a deliberately sealed underground tunnel inside. walls covered in light-reflecting pyrite and mica, hundreds of mysterious golden-coated metal spheres scattered on the ground, and traces of mercury in the soil, highly toxic mercury, which in ancient alchemy represented the flow of souls and cosmic energy. Picture it: absolute underground darkness. Torches ignite. The walls shimmer and pulse. Golden spheres catch the light everywhere you turn. What does that remind you of? An immersive virtual reality chamber. Many scholars believe this was an ancient high priest meditation chamber used for out-of-body experiences and downloading cosmic knowledge directly into the mind. The Aztecs never picked up Teotihuacan's mystical methods. Instead, they took a very different path and pushed blood and violence to their absolute extreme. In their worldview, we currently live in the fifth sun era. This sun is weak and fragile. It could go dark at any moment, so how do you recharge the sun? Simple and brutal, with fresh human blood and a still beating heart. In their eyes, cutting out a living person's heart wasn't murder. It was paying the universe's electricity bill. This is why the Aztecs were constantly at war. Not for land, not for resources. They fought to capture prisoners alive, what they called the Flower Wars. At the top of the Great Temple, a priest would raise a black obsidian blade, split open a living chest, rip out the still-pounding heart, and hold it toward the sky. Blood ran down the pyramid steps in rivers. The sight was so extreme that even the battle-hardened Spanish conquistadors, men who slaughtered without hesitation, reportedly called out to God when they witnessed it. In Aztec belief, being sacrificed wasn't a tragedy. It was an express lane to divine glory. This ideology is exactly what drove the Aztec rise to power. Not just swords, a mythology-fueled war machine that kept an entire society in motion through terror and devotion. But just as that machine was running at full speed, the Europeans arrived with gunpowder and smallpox and sent it all into history. But let's not draw the final line on American history just yet. Clear your mind of everything you think you know about early North America. Were you picturing a vast, empty prairie before the Europeans arrived? A few scattered tribes on horseback with feathers in their hair? Then, the deliberately understated prehistoric metropolis I'm about to describe is going to seriously mess with your worldview. On the Mississippi River plains of what is now Illinois, there once stood a supercity called Cahokia. At its peak, between 1050 and 1200 AD, it housed roughly 40,000 people, larger than London, England, at the same time. Its most prominent structure, Monk's Mound, stands nearly 30 meters tall and over 300 meters wide, the largest earthen construction in all of North American history. But the truly unsettling discovery: archaeologists found a massive wood henge, enormous wooden posts arranged in a perfect circle, precisely aligned with sunrises and sunsets throughout the entire year. The people of Cahokia weren't primitive hunters, they were hardcore cosmic timekeepers. So why do most Americans barely know this place exists? The answer is uncomfortable. A thriving indigenous metropolis built entirely without European help doesn't sit well with the people who write the history books. Leaving the Mound City, let's look at another unsolved mystery, scattered across the American Midwest: the animal effigy mounds. In Ohio, there's an enormous and deeply strange earthwork called the Great Serpent Mound. It stretches over 400 meters long. Standing on the ground, you can't make sense of it at all. You have to look down from hundreds of meters in the air before you can see it clearly. A perfect serpent, coiled and curved. The question is, in an era over 1,000 years ago, with no hot air balloons, no aircraft, how did they design something that can only be understood from a god's eye view? And the curves of that serpent's body align precisely with the winter solstice, solar eclipses, and even the orbital path of Halley's Comet. Still think that's coincidence? This is clearly an ancient cosmic memo, carved directly into the surface of the Earth. And speaking of obsession with the cosmos, we have to talk about the ultimate light and shadow magicians of the North American desert, the ancestral Puebloans, known as the Anasazi. In Chaco Canyon in the American Southwest, these ancient builders constructed a breathtaking stone canyon city. In a bare red desert with almost no vegetation, they built roads 9 meters wide, perfectly straight, cutting right through cliffs and ridgelines, completely ignoring the terrain. But their greatest trick was even more spectacular. High up in the canyon, there's a prehistoric observatory known as the Sun Dagger. They carved a spiral pattern into the rock, then positioned 3 stone slabs in front of it. Every year, at the exact moment of the summer solstice noon, sunlight passes through the gaps in the slabs like a razor-sharp blade of light and splits the spiral precisely in half. They could even track the moon's 6-year major lunar standstill cycle, an incredibly complex astronomical event with nothing but their eyes and stone. No telescopes. No computers, just rock and sky and perfect observation. You still want to call these people primitive, just as your head is spinning from all this? Let's take one final deep dive into South America's green hell, the Amazon rainforest. You've probably heard the legend of El Dorado, the city of gold. For hundreds of years, treasure hunters chased it into the Amazon, dying from snake bites, disease, and starvation. The famous British explorer Percy Fawcett vanished into the jungle searching for his city of Z, taking his own son with him and never returning. But what if I told you they were all looking in the wrong place? The real El Dorado was never built from gold. It was a hyper-sophisticated rainforest eco-civilization. In recent years, scientists deployed a technology called LiDAR laser radar that can penetrate dense forest canopy and scan directly to the ground. The results shattered the entire archaeological world. Hidden beneath what appeared to be untouched primeval forest, over 450 geometric earthworks were discovered. Square and octagonal city grids, perfectly straight boulevards, vast canal systems, all hidden under the leaves. This means that before the Europeans arrived, the Amazon was home to millions of people. Millions. How did they feed that population in thin rainforest soil? This is the most mind-blowing prehistoric technology of all. They engineered an artificial soil called terra preta, dark earth. Packed with charcoal and organic material, it's extraordinarily fertile, maintaining its nutritional properties for hundreds of years. And here's the jaw-dropping part. Modern scientists with electron microscopes still cannot fully replicate its formula. Beyond that, researchers have found stone walls, terraced fields, and structured rectangular stone architecture throughout the rainforest. This wilderness was once a perfectly engineered, high-tech ecological civilization. When European diseases, smallpox, and influenza arrived and wiped out 90% of the population, nature simply reclaimed the city. The jungle grew back over everything. Feeling dizzy yet? Here's one final piece. In 1513, a map appeared, the Piri-Reis map. It accurately depicted the coastline of the Americas. But it also showed Antarctica specifically, Antarctica without its ice sheet, revealing the actual landmass beneath. Keep in mind, modern humanity didn't discover Antarctica until 1820, and the map itself states clearly that it was compiled from older, more ancient source maps. Think about that carefully. Who completed a global survey of the Earth in a remote ancient era long before Columbus ever set sail? From the 20,000-year-old footprints at White Sands, to the prehistoric machined megaliths at Puma Punku, to the hidden rivers beneath Maya pyramids, to the LiDAR cities buried under the Amazon, do you notice a pattern that sends a chill straight down your spine? Every top-tier ancient site across the Americas is playing the same code. Extreme astronomical alignment, seamless megalithic construction, a deep obsession with the underworld, and timelines that completely defy conventional evolutionary theory. What does that tell us? Ancient America was never a closed, backward, primitive continent. It was almost certainly the scattered wreckage of a global super-civilization, one that was shattered long ago and left its pieces across this land. What the history books taught you is only the fraction of the iceberg that the victors chose to show you, and the truths that were deliberately buried are still down there in the earth, laughing quietly at the arrogance of the modern world. And now, tonight's final story. The truth behind Europe's first civilization and how it was buried under a lie. When you were a kid, you probably heard this particularly grim bedtime story. Deep inside a dark underground labyrinth lived a bloodthirsty monster, half man, half bull, called the Minotaur. It devoured the young men and women sent to it as tribute, until one day a sword-wielding Athenian hero charged in, followed a thread through the maze, and slew the beast. That's the famous myth of the labyrinth. But what if I told you today that story isn't mythology at all? It's the ancient world's most notorious smear campaign. That's right, We've all been deceived by the ancient Greeks themselves. That so-called man-eating maze had no monster inside it. It was actually the royal palace of Europe's very first and wealthiest superpower. While everyone else in the ancient world was still crawling through mud and fighting over scraps of food, these Mediterranean elites already had flush toilets. Their walls were covered in strikingly modern three-dimensional dolphin murals. But here's the most insane part. This Bronze Age superpower, dripping with gold, brimming with treasure, never built a single defensive wall. Not one. It's like walking down the street clutching a gold brick and leaving your front door wide open. Why did they dare live like that? And what kind of catastrophic civilization-ending blow finally wiped them from history, leaving them to be reimagined by later writers as characters in a horror story? Get comfortable, because we're about to brush away centuries of volcanic ash and step inside a Bronze Age utopia ruled by bare-breasted goddesses. The twists ahead are more mind-bending than anything in Game of Thrones. Let's rewind to the late 19th century. The fashionable way for wealthy Europeans to show off wasn't yachts or sports cars. It was funding excavations of other civilizations' ancient ruins. Enter Arthur Evans, British scholar, Oxford Museum director, and a man with serious family money. He walked away from a perfectly comfortable academic career to go hunting for rocks on the remote island of Crete. Why Crete? Because at a flea market in Athens, he noticed women wearing amulet stones carved with strange unknown symbols. His instinct fired immediately. This wasn't folk superstition. These were remnants of Europe's oldest lost writing system. He followed the trail to a scrubby hillside covered in olive trees. Previous researchers had suspected something was buried there, but local bureaucracy and stubborn landowners had stopped everyone cold. How did Sir Evans handle that problem? He didn't fight the paperwork. He simply bought the entire hill land, olive trees, and all. That's the particular joy of being rich. In the spring of 1900, the first shovel broke ground, and the world collectively lost its mind. What came up first? A massive, brilliantly coloured fresco of a noble young man. Then a high-backed throne carved from a single block of alabaster, flanked by painted winged griffins. Evans nearly had a stroke on the spot. This was the legendary throne of King Minos, and everywhere he looked, the walls were carved with the same sacred symbol, a double-headed axe. In the ancient language, that axe was called a labrise, and that word labrise is the direct origin of the word labyrinth. Evans assumed he'd found a palace with a basement. The more he dug, the more his hands shook. This wasn't a palace. This was a multi-story, city-scale complex covering several acres. Over 1,000 rooms stacked up to 5 stories high. Corridor after corridor of maze-like passages. Underground storage chambers capable of holding 200,000 gallons of wine and olive oil. And the detail that kills me, while every other ancient civilization on Earth was still relieving themselves behind a bush, the Minoans had installed complex plumbing systems and working flush toilets in their private chambers. No wonder when those wide-eyed Greek mainlanders eventually wandered into this place, got completely lost in 1,000 rooms, and went home terrified. They invented a story about a monster that ate people alive. The Minoans hadn't built a prison for a beast. They'd built a luxury shopping complex attached to a world-class administrative centre. But as the excavation deepened, something that baffled every military historian and archaeologist on Earth came to light. In a Bronze Age world that ran entirely on warfare, where the Hittites and the Egyptian pharaohs all built their city walls as thick and high as they possibly could, Knossos, this enormous palace stuffed with incalculable wealth, had no walls whatsoever. No fortifications, not even a basic perimeter barrier. Were the Minoans suicidal? Did they plan to defeat invaders with love and good vibes? Not quite. The truth is, their arrogance was baked into their DNA in the best possible way. They didn't build stone walls because they didn't need to fight on land. They had something no one else could touch, a wooden wall. A royal navy that commanded the entire Mediterranean. This is what historians call a thalassocracy rule by sea power. The Minoan fleet was the ancient world's equivalent of a modern carrier strike group. Their warships patrolled the Aegean every single day. If you even thought about approaching Crete with bad intentions, your ship would be splinters before it reached the shore. By pushing their defensive perimeter all the way out to the enemy's doorstep, they secured centuries of absolute domestic peace. and because they felt completely safe, they didn't spend their wealth on cold defensive infrastructure. Instead, they poured every resource into art, pleasure, and one of the strangest religious traditions the ancient world has ever produced. Brace yourself, because we're about to walk into the mother goddess fantasy world of the Minoans and see how they turn death-defying risk into a spectator sport. If a Bronze Age empire with no walls already seems impossible, what I'm about to show you will shatter everything you think you know about ancient societies. Every ancient civilization we know of East and West was dominated by men. Kings, pharaohs, emperors, even the gods were mostly male. But in Minoan Crete, all of that was reversed. In this labyrinthine palace, archaeologists uncovered hundreds of elaborate seals and frescoes. And in every single image of a person holding power, presiding over sacred rituals, receiving worship from crowds, the figure is female. Men appear in these images too, but only as attendants, musicians, or kneeling audience members. The most striking symbol of this civilization's spiritual core came from a small hidden pit inside the palace, a series of deeply unsettling statuettes. These are the famous snake goddesses. Picture this, a woman with an ice-cold expression and razor-sharp eyes. She wears the most fashionable layered dress of the era, but her upper body is completely bare, intentionally and unapologetically exposed. Before you assume this was simply primitive, think again. In the Minoan symbolic language, bared breasts represented absolute life force, the source of Earth's fertility. But that's not even the shocking part. This goddess holds her arms raised high. In each hand, she grips a writhing, venomous snake. On top of her elaborate headdress crouches a fierce feline, something like a leopard, bare chest, living serpents, a predator on her head. These three elements together push the sense of wildness, death, and rebirth to an almost unbearable intensity. In that era, snakes could travel underground, shed their skin, and emerge reborn. They represented the deepest mysteries of the underworld. The Minoans weren't worshipping a radiant sun god. They were devoted to the Earth Mother, the dark, cyclical force that held the keys to life and death. So what did these privileged, palace-dwelling Minoans do for entertainment in the enormous central courtyard? Polo, gladiatorial combat, too boring. They played a game that would make modern extreme athletes turn pale, sacred bull leaping. This is nothing like Spanish bullfighting, where a matador hides behind a cape. What the Minoans did was so hardcore, it defies modern belief. Imagine this. The palace balconies packed with finely dressed Minoan nobility. In the center of the courtyard, a full-grown bull, over 1,000 pounds, enraged and at full charge. No weapons, no armor. Just a group of lean, unprotected young men and women running directly toward this living battering ram. At the precise fraction of a second before those horns pierce their chests, they grab the bull's horns, both of them, barehanded. Using the bull's instinct to throw its head violently upward, these athletes launch themselves into the air 2 meters up and execute a perfect, completely unprotected back handspring. Then they land on the bull's back and then drop to the ground. Think about what that actually means. You're standing in the middle of a highway. A truck is coming at full speed. And instead of diving out of the way, you grab the front bumper, flip over the hood, stick a landing on the roof, and step off the back. 1/10 of a second off the timing, or the bull doesn't follow the expected arc of motion, and these young athletes are gored through the chest or crushed to a paste under 4 hooves. Why would anyone do this? Because to the Minoans, the bull was the ultimate embodiment of raw natural force. They weren't trying to kill it. They were proving, through this near-impossible act of grace under lethal pressure, that they could dance with the most violent force in nature and survive. Now, do you understand? This is the real origin of the Minotaur myth. When later Greeks, who had never seen anything like this, stumbled onto the frescoes of these bull-leaping ceremonies and heard that young people from outside Crete were dying on this island every year during athletic training, their terrified imaginations transformed a breathtaking, deadly national sport into a monster that ate children alive. When all this art and sculpture was first unearthed, the archaeological world erupted. But for Evans, the man who had bought the whole hillside in the first place, there was one mystery that never left him. He hadn't come here for gold or bull-jumping acrobats. He was a man obsessed with writing. He came for code, and deep in the fire-scorched ruins of Knossos, he found it. Hundreds of flat clay tablets, covered in elegant incised lines, chariot sketches, and very clear numerical accounts. What nobody realized at first, the great fire that destroyed the palace had not destroyed these fragile clay tablets. It had baked them, like a kiln, hardening them to stone and preserving them for over 3,000 years. Evans categorized the tablets into two groups. The older, more fluid-looking script he called Linear A. The slightly later, stiffer one he called Linear B. For 50 years, these two scripts were the greatest unsolved puzzle in linguistics. The world's top codebreakers and language scholars stared at them and got nowhere. Then, after World War II, a British architect named Michael Ventris entered the picture. Not an academic, an architect, who had been drafted as a military codebreaker during the war. He attacked Linear B the way you'd break enemy encryption. And in 1952, he cracked it. What he found was a bombshell. Linear B was ancient Greek. That single discovery detonated like a nuclear bomb in the history community, because it meant that in the palace's final chapter, the people running the place had changed. The Greek mainland warlords, who had always been kept at arm's length by the Minoan fleet, had at some point occupied this unwalled city and were keeping records in their own language. But before anyone could celebrate, a deeper and more devastating problem appeared. If Linear B was the invaders' Greek, then Linear A, the older script, was the true mother tongue of the Minoans themselves. And that language, the one that encoded their centuries of brilliant civilization, their prayers to the snake goddess, their records of the bull-leaping ceremonies, remains completely undeciphered to this day. In the 21st century, with artificial intelligence reshaping the world, not one human being can read a single word of Linear A. And archaeologists found something else at another palace site that only deepens the mystery. A small clay disc, just 15 centimeters across, covered in 45 unique symbols arranged in a spiral. Stamped into the clay, not scratched. Stamped meaning the Minoans were using something remarkably close to movable type printing technology thousands of years before Gutenberg. What the disc says, or what it means, nobody knows. This is the deepest frustration the Minoan civilization leaves us with. We can see their astonishing art. We can see the bull-leaping athletes frozen in mid-flip. We can calculate exactly how many jars of olive oil they stored, but we're watching a film that's been completely silenced. They stand on the far side of history like beautiful, mute ghosts, mouths open, speaking words we will never hear. And now this civilization, whose very voice has been stolen, was about to face a force that made all human achievement look fragile. Something in the sea above them was quietly gathering the energy of a god. In the golden final decades of the 17th century BC, the Minoans were at the absolute peak of their power. Their fleet threaded the entire Aegean like veins in a living body. Even the mightiest Egyptian pharaohs received Minoan ambassadors as honoured guests. If you had asked a Minoan citizen back then how their empire might fall, they would have thought you were insane. But history's script is always more ruthless than any writer's imagination. And what destroyed this superpower wasn't a rival army wielding bronze swords, it was the planet itself. About 70 miles north of Crete sat one of the most beautiful islands in the Aegean, Thera, the same island you'd visit today as Santorini. At its centre was a prosperous port city called Akrotiri, multi-storey townhouses, brilliant frescoes, concentrated wealth. But directly beneath all of that splendour, sleeping under the island's surface, was a volcano. Death gave warning before it arrived. First came a series of powerful earthquakes. The people of Akrotiri recognized the signs and responded with remarkable discipline. They gathered their most valuable possessions and evacuated the city entirely. We know this with certainty because when modern archaeologists excavated what is essentially a Bronze Age Pompeii, they found overturned furniture, broken pottery, and not a single human skeleton. But the people who fled to the sea had no idea what was coming. When Thera finally erupted, it wasn't just an eruption. It was one of the most violent explosions in human history, significantly more powerful than the famous Krakatoa eruption centuries later. With a roar that was heard hundreds of miles away, the entire mountain tore itself apart. A column of superheated ash, pumice, and toxic gas punched 20 miles into the sky, a mushroom cloud over the ancient Aegean. Picture the sky above Crete turning first a sickly yellow, then being swallowed entirely by dense volcanic ash. Daylight vanishing in seconds. Total darkness in the middle of the afternoon. but the worst was still coming. When the magma chamber beneath Thera was emptied by the eruption, the center of the island lost its foundation and collapsed into the sea. Think of dropping a bowling ball into a bathtub. The displaced water exploded outward. A series of tsunamis, dozens of meters high, screamed toward every shore in every direction. On the northern coast of Crete, the Minoans looked up and saw the sky had turned black. Then they noticed something worse. The sea along the coast was retreating at impossible speed, exposing the bare seabed. If you see that happen, you have less than 2 minutes to run. The wave hit. The harbours, the port towns, the magnificent seafront villas, all of it erased in minutes. And the thing the Minoans had staked their entire civilization on, their invincible royal fleet, was smashed to driftwood in the same ports where it had been built. When the waves pulled back, a volcanic winter settled in. The sun became a dim smudge. A thick, toxic layer of pale ash buried eastern Crete, choking farmland, poisoning crops, contaminating every water source for people and animals alike. The Minoans had believed themselves masters of the ocean, favourites of nature. Nature had answered with a single gesture and wiped out everything they thought made them untouchable. You might think this is where the story ends. The Minoans destroyed all at once in a single catastrophe. But the real history is always crueler than that. The most painful kind of death isn't instant. It's slow. It's watching yourself bleed out over decades, unable to stop it. For a long time, everyone assumed the eruption alone had ended Minoan civilization. But later excavations revealed something chilling. The tsunami and earthquake had devastated the coastal and eastern regions, but the core of Crete, including Knossos itself, had survived. Shaken, weakened, but still standing. Not dead yet, just dying. For a civilization built entirely on maritime trade, the loss of the fleet was economic death. No ships meant no tin, no copper, no bronze. The warehouses full of olive oil sat unsellable. The economic artery had been severed in a single afternoon. Famine followed, but what may have been even more destructive was the collapse of faith. The Minoans were a people who revered nature above everything. Their priests had promised that as long as they honoured the earth goddess, as long as they leaped over bulls and danced for the serpent, the natural world would protect them. Then the sun disappeared. The earth split open. The sea came crashing through the front door. The survivors looked around and drew the only conclusion available. The goddess had abandoned them. That kind of civilizational spiritual collapse destroys the authority of every ruler and every institution. Society fractured. And while that wounded lion lay gasping, the hyenas arrived. From across the Aegean came the Mycenaeans, mainland Greeks. Where the Minoans had been artists, traders, acrobats, and goddess worshippers, the Mycenaeans were something else entirely. War was their identity. They wore heavy bronze plate armor. They hunted in boar tusk helmets. They lived for combat and plunder. While the Minoan fleet had existed, these mainland thugs hadn't dared make a sound. Now the fleet was gone. The Aegean had a power vacuum, and the Mycenaeans kicked open a door that had never needed a lock. But the most haunting detail of their conquest is this. They didn't burn the palace. They moved in. Like parasites taking over a host, the Mycenaean warlords sat down on the Minoan throne, used the Minoan plumbing, and started keeping records in their own language. Which is exactly why, when Ventris cracked the later Linear B tablets centuries later, he found Greek. These conquerors had helped themselves to an entire civilization's infrastructure without understanding what made it great. And then came the cultural erasure. The Mycenaeans had no artistic talent of their own, but they recognized genius when they saw it, so they forced the surviving Minoan painters to keep working. But the images changed. The blue dolphins leaping through flowers disappeared. The bare-breasted goddess was painted over. In their place, wild boar hunts. Rows of heavily armoured infantry marching to slaughter. War chariots symbolising absolute male dominance. The civilization that had been built by women, centred on joy and reverence for life, was forcibly hollowed out and refilled with testosterone and violence. The Minoan spirit was extinguished, but the body was kept on life support, shuffling through its own palace like a ghost, for nearly another 100 years. Around 1375 BC, it finally ended. A catastrophic fire more total in its destruction than even the tsunami swept through the entire palace of Knossos. 6 acres of some of the most sophisticated architecture ever built burned to ash. The great red columns that had stood for centuries turned to charcoal. The dolphin frescoes blackened and crumbled in the heat. To this day, no one knows how the fire started. Some historians believe the surviving Minoans finally rose up in one last desperate revolt against their Mycenaean overlords. Others think the conquerors turned on each other, fighting over trade routes until someone lit a match. Whatever the cause, the result was final. Europe's first palace, which had stood for 500 years, was never rebuilt. But did the Minoan civilization simply vanish? Not quite. It survived in a different form, hidden inside the nightmares and legends of the people who came after. Those vast, real palaces, the lethal, breathtaking, bull-leaping ceremonies, the powerful rulers of the sea, all of it was absorbed by later Greeks who had never come close to anything like it, and transformed into man-eating labyrinths, bull-headed monsters, and the tyrant, Minos. They wove their terror of a civilization 1,000 years ahead of their own into mythology and passed it down through generations. 2,000 years later, a wealthy British scholar with a pickaxe and a blank cheque finally tore that mythological veil away. Today, when you walk among those reconstructed red columns, patched with concrete, faded by time, you're not just looking at ruins. You're looking at the compressed tragedy of a utopia destroyed by nature and violence in the same breath. The art the Minoans left behind, the technology, the deep reverence for the living earth. All of it became the earliest nourishment for what would grow into Western civilization. They lost their language. Their voice was taken from them. But those leaping dolphins and the cold, sharp eyes of the snake goddess are still there, quietly reminding us that in this blue sea, once upon a time, there existed a world of extraordinary beauty, extraordinary madness, and extraordinary fragility. And now the last ember of the Minoan civilization has finally gone dark. Good night.